All right, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining with us. It is 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is our webinar series for our educators, those of you who are preparing to do distance learning, and those of you who may already be doing distance learning and are really excited to think about ways that you can continue to engage your students with STEM concepts, with STEM content, with high fidelity, even though we can't be physically close to our students. We can still really maintain the spirit of learning STEM and fun in really rigorous ways. So thanks so much for joining us again. Today we'll be looking specifically at ways to really tap into math skills and math skills across a whole spectrum, whether or not your students are not necessarily beginners, but just at the beginning of their educational journey. So thinking first grade, second grade, even kindergarten in some aspects, you can do this work all the way through high school. Working with drones is a great way to bring those skills and concepts together as our students are learning more and more about math and about drones. A great place to begin is always at the beginning. Before I say anything else, I want to remind our participants, for some of you, this is the first time you'll hear me saying this, we have my colleague, Michelle Russell. She is a STEM trainer at Next Wave STEM, and she will be manning the chat box. So if you've got any questions or comments or funny stories, we are completely open to them. I think we have been spending enough time on Zoom, all of us, to finally get to the funny stories section of the social order that we're in right now. So drop a comment in the chat. We'll make sure we get it addressed or even critiqued live on the chat today. And we'll make sure that we leave a little bit of time for ourselves at the end to ask any or answer any lingering questions or ask any lingering questions. So Next Wave STEM, just a little bit of background about us for those who don't know, really without reading off the slide at all. It's about making sure that the students that we have today are prepared for the workplace of tomorrow, for technology of tomorrow. We believe that's really critical, and we believe the best way to do that is with hands-on learning, as much as we can possibly do. Now, while hands-on learning in the STEM space may be a little difficult right now, we are very fortunate to be living in the time that we're living at. One, we can continue to connect to our educators and with our students digitally, but two, there are tools available for us to be able to think in really exciting and abstract ways. To the point that we're able to simulate and do abstractions with respect to a lot of the hands-on technology, even with our drones. So I'm really excited to share that with you all today. So 3 main goals for today's training, and we're going to dive right into it because we actually do have quite a bit to go through. Um, but the first is we want to explore algebraic thinking for students who are using block-based coding. That's going to come more towards the end of our talk, but I'm really excited because we're going to cover not just algebraic thinking, but a really more holistic model for the way that we can integrate math into all of our STEM practices. The second thing, and we'll be doing this throughout the entire webinar, is thinking about designing challenges and scenarios for our students to solve using abstract thinking. We'll dig into abstract thinking some more, but we know that because our students may not have access to all of our technology, in this case, a drone, it's going to be important for them to combine the real world and even the models and the simulations that we'll be able to do with them in order to solve these problems. The awesome thing about what we're doing as well is that the code doesn't have to go anywhere. It just doesn't disappear, it doesn't evaporate. These are things that when we are back to more like business as usual, we'll be able to actually do with our actual drone equipment. So we're setting ourselves up to really lay a groundwork before we do some real world testing. And then finally, we'll talk about how we build those real world connections between mathematics, the abstract concepts and motions that we see in the simulation using the drones, and things in real world scenarios and problems that we'll actually be able to solve. Um, so with those goals in mind, we'll press right ahead. Um, First and foremost, the software that we use is called Tello Edu. Some of you are repeats from our first webinar. Um, Glad to have you back. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, Next Wave STEM, we're providing curricula, courses, uh, and professional development in emerging technologies. Those technologies include robots, computers, and AI, also 3D printing, but we focus on drones. Tello EDU is our drone application that allows for block-based coding. It also gives us the extra benefit of connecting directly to our drones to allow for their autonomous flight. Now, the great thing about it is it's completely free to use for yourselves and for your students. It allows students to save their code, to save those blocks. Michelle is doing us a huge favor right now. She's dropping a link to both of those applications in the chat box. So if you're interested in downloading applications and kind of following along or experimenting with Tello EDU yourself, you're able to do that today. Just click on whichever link works for you, Android or iOS. You can jump in right there and begin. So as some of you are downloading those applications, I'm sure, I want to talk a little bit more holistically about what we think about when we do mathematical practice. And this is irrespective of the technology that you use. This really predates our thinking of that acronym STEM, even though math is included in that acronym. When we teach mathematics, and this is a standard set that was really contrived by the NCTM, National Council for Teachers of Mathematics. It's also a guiding set of principles and practices that sits at the heart of Common Core standards. So regardless of what grade level, be it kindergarten or be it high school, 12th grade mathematics, we see these 8 mathematical principles and practices always at play. Curriculum designers, educators, professional development providers, it's really critical that we think about these things that are going on. So as your students are learning math, no matter what the age, we want them to be able to make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. That's really more about understanding that they've got different skills and different tool sets. We don't want them just to focus on one way of doing something. We want them to be able to understand the meaning of a problem. And once they understand the meaning of the problem, think about the constraints, the relationships, the goals of the problem, and then attack that problem from multiple angles. Um, as they are reasoning abstractly and quantitatively, it's going to be important that our students are able to connect not only the quantitative, what we would consider the hard numbers and figures and units and processes, but we also want them to think about those relationships and what they would mean in less concrete ways. Can they decontextualize maybe the unit and just understanding the underlying idea that is at the root of a problem? Can they understand the relationship between different weights or the same weight? The great example of that is that old question: if I drop 100 pounds of feathers and 100 pounds of lead from the air, which one will hit the ground first? Can they just decontextualize the unit and build a relationship between what weight is, to think about when those things hit the ground? The third thing that we want our students to be able to learn and that we want to teach them is to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Um, This is really, really great because there are cross-cutting principles here with regards to next generation science standards, something we hold in really, really high regards at Next Wave STEM. It's important that our students are able to communicate their reasoning and their thinking, and to do that in a team context. Um, this applies to project-based learning as well. Can you explain the decisions that you made and why you made them? Fourth, and this seems pretty simple, but it's also really, really cool, students will have to model with mathematics. Can they apply the math that they know in order to really graphically represent what's going on? Are they going to be able to visualize their processes as well, whether that's distributing in between in the multiplication, if you're thinking about using the distributive property, or if it's something a lot more complex, like a 3D modeling in space of coordinates and points representing different locations on the Earth. If they can model their concepts, then that's an enhanced form of communication. Um, Using appropriate tools, not stools, but tools strategically is really building that skill set that they'll have in their mathematics arsenal and knowing how to apply it. Attending to precision is something that's really, really interesting because some of our problems, some of the processes that we need them to follow and that the world will require them to follow will require a high degree of precision. And in order to build that precision, students will need the mathematical skill to evaluate intermediate steps in their processes. If, and I'll relate it to the drone here, if they can adjust their code to be able to fly the drone in a slightly different way at the beginning of a program, that may dramatically change where their drone ends up at the end of a program. So we're thinking about not just the starting conditions and the result, but also the intermediate steps. Looking for and making use of structure is going to be really important, thinking about the processes. Um, Going back again to the distributive property, can we learn that if we distribute in one part of a problem and we distribute in a second part of a problem, that process may work later on in the third part of the problem? Or to once again think about computer science, something that we'll see in a little bit, can we think about different actual block structures, different ways of connecting and constructing our code that we can show and prove will generate a particular result, and then use that or modify that over and over again over time. And then we're going to be looking for and expressing regularity in repeated reasoning. Can they extrapolate out much more complex mathematical ideas from simpler ideas? All these things you can use at any grade level as you're working with your students, but in particular with our drones. And a lot of that is because you've got these cross-cutting ideas in mathematics. And specifically in science and engineering standards, when we think about the ability to communicate what we learn and working in teams, it is a really, really powerful tool that allows us to do that. So if you were with us in our first webinar, you learned that a drone definitionally is something pretty simple. Well, a drone is almost what the drone does. And what the drone does is generally speaking, follow a simple directive, go from point A to point B. Um, it uses sensors to do this. And a sensor is just any piece of equipment that allows a machine to know something about what's going on outside of the machine. If human beings were machines, the sensors that we would have are fingers to be able to feel things, eyes to be able to see things, ears to be able to hear things going on around us. Those are our sensors, and those are also called our sensory organs. In the same way, drones have sensors, and those sensors are completely varied. They measure the drone's position, how fast it's flying, how much it's turning, how high it is in the air. It's able to get visual data using that camera that many drones have. So a combination of sensors and our computer programming knowledge, the actual instructions we give the drone, allow the drone to do what we need the drone to do, fly from point A to point B. And it's using that simple idea that our drone moves, that it moves autonomously, and it has access to sensors, allows us to create a scenario where we can, or actually multiple scenarios, where we can evaluate our students' mathematical learning and apply some interesting mathematical concepts. So what's going to happen now, and we've got plenty of time to do this, we're going to actually take a look at three different scenarios. And these three different scenarios will allow us to explore the different ways in which we can apply mathematical thinking, kind of also thinking about different skill levels and experience levels when flying drones. I think I saw somebody alert me. I thought I saw a hand that was raised, but I don't see that hand now. So now is a great point to reiterate. If you've got any questions, we've got the Q&A bubble and you have the chat. If you need me to slow it down a little bit, I can do that as well. I get excited. I'm excitable. And when I get excited, I can also kind of zoom off and run. So if you need me to slow it down, I can do that as well. So our first scenario, and don't worry, everything's words right now, but we're going to cut over into our actual drone software. I downloaded an emulator so that we can show off exactly how the drone software will look as students are doing this. Um, Ways that we can think about these scenarios, regardless of the age that we're working with, or if we're working with an age band, say 3 to 5, for example, is to think from the perspective of the practices that we want to engage. Those 8 practices are robust, but they're also decently general, and we don't need to feel like we have to teach all of math in every single one of these scenarios. The cone Nicole just asked a really good question. Have you flown a drone in your house? Yes. The drones that connect to the drone software that we use is Hello Drones. I'll try to do the best representation with my hand that I can. If you about the size of my face, kind of where my fingers are framed, is about that big, and it's something that we've flown exclusively indoors. I'm hoping some of our other participants have also flown drones in their houses or indoors before. If they haven't, that could be an interesting experience. If they have, I would love to hear about that interesting experience in the chat. So, as I was saying, we don't have to feel as though we have to um, teach all of math in every single drone experience. We couldn't do that if we wanted to. There's just too much math to teach. Instead, we can use real world connections to scenarios to really build upon some key points that we want to teach when we think about those math principles. So scenario number one, I've named it toilet paper delivery. In the first couple weeks of social distancing, I'm sure some of us have read news reports about those who were a little bit concerned about how much toilet paper they did or didn't have. And you may be in your house and may be a little inconvenienced to not want to go get toilet paper. Why not have our drone do it? Why don't we solve a problem? So in this example, students would need to construct a flight program for their drone to effectively deliver toilet paper from one part of their home to another. And as we're doing that, that's a really broad idea, but we can give some definition for our students as well. And there are tools available to them at home. So we will revisit some of these tools, but before we do that, let's actually jump into our coding software so that we can see what this might look like. This is the top screen of Tello EDU. When you open the app for the first time, you'll be directed to the screen. And what we use to code our drones is actually the coding environment. And when I click on this green puzzle piece, it will take us directly into our coding environment. Awesome. So our coding environment, for those of you who have ever used Scratch or any kind of block-based coding before, is really helpful. It allows us to focus on not necessarily the actual ability of our students to type or spell when writing code. Think about when you learned JavaScript or HTML, or if you don't know what any of those words mean, you definitely wouldn't know what Python is. But if you are teaching Python, if you know Python, and if you're writing in complex coding languages and you're teaching your students how to write in complex coding languages, you know that there's oftentimes an issue when we forget a semicolon, or we forget a dash, or something is capitalized or is not capitalized, or we didn't comment something out. We can break our code very easily. The great thing about blocks and about coding with blocks is that we don't have to worry about how well we can spell. Instead, what we can really focus on is the logic for the instructions that we're giving the machine, and then also think about the processes and the smaller components that we build into bigger components. It takes a lot of the hard work of programming things and getting things out of the equation when it comes to our ability to enter in those instructions. So our first scenario is one where we want to give our drones instructions to transport an object from point A to point B. When I click on the eyeball here in our coding environment, that will take us to the actual star of the show with regards to our software, which is our drone flying simulation. And I'm going to drag this little button out of the way so we've got a little space to work. Oh, well, we'll drag him out of the way later. Our drone here is a simulated environment example of the exact drone that the software connects to. And if I want to make the drone fly, I'm thinking about my students. Our students are going to have to program in some actions. Anytime we want our drone to fly, I have to drop the takeoff in, and our drone is going to have to end with a land. This menu to the left, before I get a little too far ahead of myself, gives us all of our abilities to give our drones instructions. The motion menu is exactly what it sounds like. It gives our drone the ability to move. We've got the ability to move in 3 dimensions, up and down, left and right, and forward and backward with our drone. But also, if I use the go XYZ or curve blocks to fly in diagonals or fly in curved patterns as well. I know my hand is doing a lot there on the screen, but that's kind of the quick and easy way to talk about what those motions might look like. So simple instruction here to start with as a demonstration. I could just tell the drone to take off. Instead of landing right away, I will be a little fancy and add a front flip as a celebration. So our drone will take off, do a flip, and then land. We've got the ability to and just tell our drone how to move. And from that point, we can start to abstract. So in the abstraction that I may use, you can define this abstraction, you can define the constraints, you can talk about how far or how short or where things are located in the house. The drone, the students are just imagining and using the abstraction of the drone moving from one place to another. We could define this starting point as the place where the drone might have our piece of toilet paper or our roll of toilet paper, and define a very simple motion. The closet may be directly in front of us and we don't want to walk to that closet. We have had enough. We've watched too much of the news. The dog has been getting on our nerves. We've had lasagna for the 3rd night in a row. I don't feel like going to go get that toilet tissue. Well, let's make the drone go do it for us. So we'll have the drone take off, fly forward whatever distance to the toilet paper that is. And then this is the part where we'll have to continue to abstract what we want the drone to do. The drone has a land function that allows our drone to do exactly that, land, descend to the ground. In our scenario, our toilet paper will be on the ground as well. So landing will place our drone on the bottom of our toilet paper. Once our drone has captured the toilet paper, we want that drone to take off and get into the air again. And this time, we want the drone to come back to where it began. In this scenario, that would be right next to where we are. So we have a takeoff point defined, you have a distance forward to our target destination, you have a motion in order to capture the target item, you have a takeoff again in order to get the drone back up in the air, then we have backwards to return the drone. In our scenario, we want that drone to return the same distance that took off from. And then we want the drone to land. Now, one thing I also want to encourage with you is when you're playing around and you're experimenting with the application, you have to think about the device that you're using. It works on your cell phone, it works on iPads, it works on Android tablets or Chromebooks as well. But the one thing that you want to be cognizant of is the target. And when I talk about target, I'm talking about actually where your finger will go. The bigger the screen is, the bigger the actual icons are, the easier it is to target and drag and drop. So just something to keep in mind with our K through 2s with respect to their dexterity. So we finally have this program, take off, forward, land, capture our toilet tissue, take off again, go back from where you started and land again to deliver the toilet tissue. And our simulation allows us to see that in action. So when I press start, I can pivot around and actually see what that drone motion looks like just by turning. And we'll see that our drone has returned back to the place where it started. So that's a really simple program. That program, you can think of something that you could do with your K through 2s and even your middle schoolers, 3 through 5s, as you're doing an introductory lesson with the drones. It took 6 blocks to be able to run this particular program. But the great thing about it is that we're just talking about exploring concepts. So I'm actually going to jump back into our slide deck because we can think more robustly about how this looks like in our actual homes, or if we're working in the garage, it is something that we can really continue to explore. In our homes, if we're not doing just a completely abstract scenario, we can actually think about where our different objects are located. If the toilet tissue isn't in a closet 500 centimeters away, maybe it's someplace that we can actually take measurements of. So we can start to employ measuring tools. It might be a ruler, it might be a yardstick. That's something that some of us have available to us. And measuring tape works really well, and we know how much students love to measure things. There are also things like measuring applications in our phones that we can use. If you're an iPhone user, I forget exactly what it's called, it might just be called Measure. Allows you to use your camera as a virtual measuring device. It's really, really cool. Android users, that same tool is also available to you. I think it's also called Measure. Yes, Michelle says it's also called Measure on Android as well. So you've got hand tools that you can use digital tools, but we can bring things down to a level of understanding when we think about units and measurement, even for students who as kindergartners. Maybe they aren't going to use rulers and they're not working on their unit sense yet. There are other tools that we can use as units for measure. Our students and our kids' shoes are all over the place. I don't have any little ones of my own, but for my colleagues who do, they have been really enjoying, and I mean that sincerely, really enjoying how much time that they're spending with their kids and seeing their shoes and bags and unkempt persons all over the place. during the time of social distancing and quarantine, we can use those shoes as measuring devices. How many shoes from the closet the to the sink, and how can we then convert that into units? Some of our students are going to be learning about centimeters natively. So that's the kind of thing where they can expand that learning and connect that to real world distances. And then it could be as simple as using something that they have in terms of crafting. You may have a bunch of toilet tissue rolls or milk crates or milk jugs or paper towel rolls. Those things that might end up in a recycling as craft drawer things can now serve as units for measurements as well. So that first scenario, things that we can change are the distances, the actual tools that we use to measure, and the tools that we use in terms of making measurement comparisons, teaching our students how to record that kind of data with fidelity as well. So I actually want to back up a few slides. There we are. We want to be able to reason abstractly and quantitatively. The abstract reasoning comes in engaging the simulation and thinking about the drone's measurements, but then paying attention to how precise we are with those measurements. We want to create a scenario that if I tested it with a real drone, the drone would be able to do what we wanted to do and move where we wanted it to move. So that's kind of like our level one idea of a scenario. And this is a perfect time for me to also mention that these ideas are really here to get our juices flowing, things that you can actually do with software with your students as you're designing experiences with your students. If you want access to some more ideas, sign up in the link that you'll be receiving after this webinar. If you're on with us today, you'll be receiving a link to have access to our drones curricula. So you can take a look at that, mix and match, pull from, use in its entirety or not use at all. Or you could just reach out to us and get more information about how we do certain things in the drone curricula. That's something we want to empower you with today. Our second scenario is really, really cool because now we're going to be expanding our students' thinking a little bit more from just what can happen inside of my house to what might be able to happen outside of my house. And as we're designing this lesson, regardless of whether we're thinking once again about our young learners or we're thinking up through our high school learners, you want to pay attention to those core and common core mathematical practices. So the two that we've chosen for the scenario is that we want to look for and make use of structure as we're doing mathematics, but we also want to construct viable arguments and then critique the reasoning of others. And that second practice is really, really engaging. That's something that you'll be able to do with your students as you're connecting with them through whichever LMS you use, whether that's Google Classroom or Moodle or Schoology, or natively through email or live in person as you're connecting at distance. Scenario two is this idea of front yard cartography, making maps and really taking pictures to make maps. So students will need to construct a flight program for the drone to effectively map the area of their front yard. Already my math teachers are saying, oh, area popped up. I know that's something that we're going to be working on. How can we explore this idea a little bit more? We're also going to be introducing this idea of constraints. We're only going to give our students 10 blocks to complete this task. So that may make a huge difference depending on what a student's front yard looks like. But we can explore that more and more once we dig into flight with our drones. And of course, just like I mentioned, there are some constraining factors here, but there are also some tools that are going to be able to help us out. Before we dig into that with a lot more depth, what I want to do is go back to our simulation software. Let's take a look at how this might work in Tello edu. . So now that we are switched back over to our simulation software, I love this example program that I started with, but I don't love it so much that I want to keep it forever. So I'm just going to throw it in the trash. So now we have our drone. We're ready to simulate. We have our drone kind of um, sitting here ready to receive instructions, and we have to now define how we want our drone to move. And we also have the constraint of how much code we can actually use, how many blocks of code we can use. And our constraint is actually kind of a hidden constraint because we know whatever code we write, whichever blocks we drag, we have to start with a takeoff block. And while it's not said explicitly, we're going to end with a land block. And the reason why we end with that land block is because if we don't, our drone will just hang in the air until the battery dies. Not a great experience to then have to wait for our new battery to recharge. Next Wave Sim can help you with that when it comes to equipment, but we don't necessarily want to waste that flight time. So we know that we've got 2 blocks accounted for already. We're already thinking through where our constraints will have to be. Now we have to think of our motion. Well, I don't have a front yard or a backyard, but if I did, I think I would want that front yard or backyard to be nice and rectangular shape, some kind of four-sided, four-cornered figure. Maybe because I'm a little bit of a neat freak, but I like to keep things nice and geometric if I can. So when it comes to the motion, where I actually want my drone to fly and how I want my drone to fly. One thing that might be useful, not to fly up, because I don't necessarily need altitude, but instead I'll fly forward. I might make a turn to make sure that my camera is pointing in the right direction. In this case, we want to use the left yaw. That's the actual block that controls the rotation of the drone. And then after I rotate my drone to the left, I might fly forward again some distance. So in this case, I think I only fly forward half the distance that I started with before. So I've got some motion here, and I've got some motion that I can test out. So when I tap start, I've got a forward flight, a left rotation, and then a smaller forward flight again. And I know I was rotating the camera during that flight, so we didn't see it very well. We'll run it again. And our drone will land. So now we get a kind of sense of the L, almost like if you're a chess player, the way the knight moves in that L shape. Our drone is also making that particular flight. And that's great, but I've used 5 blocks already to be able to do that. How in the world would I be able to take pictures of an abstraction, get the drone in a position where it could take pictures of a rectangular area? Well, instead of having my drone fly forward and turn once, and I made the mistake of deleting that, I will just pull that piece back out, do a left yaw, and pull, fly forward again. I can now engage my students with computer science logic. So I've got a set of instructions, simple set here in the middle, 3 pieces of instructions. Fly forward 100 centimeters, turn left, a perfect 90-degree turn, then fly forward 50 centimeters, which happens to be half the distance of that 100. Instead of having my drone make a bunch of different motions, I'll just tell my drone to repeat a flight. And now I'm well within the constraints that I had previously. So running this now, we can kind of see this abstraction come and find some life where using now only 6 blocks, I've got the drone flying in a pattern that if I really thought about flying or tracing out the geometrical path, or even having my students go out and walk and simulate physically the geometrical path, we can go around our front yards and think about how much of the front yard is actually going to get covered. I have a question here. Willard asked a really, really good question as I continue to allow my drone to fly its pattern. Why didn't I use up? Well, there's no rule that necessarily says that I can't use up. So what I'll do is instead of forward, I'll modify this inside instruction a little bit. Instead of just having a forward here in the middle, I'll also, because I've got some more blocks to play with, include an up. And I'll be very careful with my targets. We'll drop an up. So, and I don't want my drone to go 100 centimeters up. That's a decent amount. I'll decrease that to 50 centimeters. We got to think through the actual processes that our drones are going to be flying in, and the concepts of the way the drones will move through three-dimensional space. That means that if I include an up block, especially inside of the repeat, my drone will take off, fly up, and then rotate that motion. So I'm getting my abstract camera shots, but I'm also going up more and more and more for each rotation. So much so that maybe my drone is no longer around the perimeter of the house, or the front yard, I should say, but now I'm going up past my second story, or up into my tree branches, or further up beyond my tree branches, or I might be worried about power lines or poles. Something that we have to really consider is the fact that our drones are going to be flying in three-dimensional space. You can kind of tell in the background there, my drone actually stopped with 2 remaining cycles left on the program because I went further up than the drone simulation would support. So we're always thinking about what's going to happen in 3D space. Up and down will control our drone's motion in the up and down space, that's Z axis. And if we're flying indoors, our ceilings are our limited spaces. We want to make sure that we understand how that works. Oh, I saw a really interesting comment here. Roman does have a story. He flew the drone indoors for Christmas. What else would you what else would you do with the drone that you get for Christmas? Flying indoors is a good way to learn very different lessons. Our curriculum talks about the ethics and safety of drone use. Flying drone indoors is a quick way to learn some lessons about drone use. So that's kind of the abstraction of the way that we would tackle scenario number 2, where we've included drone logic, but also included a constraint that allows us to really think more deeply about what's happening with our drone. I'm going to flip back now to our slide deck, because we want to think about the tools that will allow us to really use that tangible things that we can use with our students, or that our students can use themselves and have easy access to. I love Google Maps. Google Maps is a great tool for all kinds of learning, including learning about the world around us, especially in the context of surface area and perimeters for structures. We can zoom in on spaces. If I'm particularly interested in the front yard or the side yard of this house, or even the backyard, which looks like a really, really nice quadrilateral shape here, or trapezoidal shape, if I discount kind of the nook by what I imagine is kitchen. I've got an area now that I can work with and plot out. I can drop a line in Google Maps and get an estimate for these distances. So maybe I'm building a flight plan ahead of time before I simulate it. And then we have those tools that allow us to take even better measurements. Our phones, because they have gyroscopes and our GPS connected, can also be used as compasses. Um, and of course, those compasses allow us to do a better job with measuring the actual rotational angle that our drones are taking at any given time. So for those of us who are middle school teachers, teaching about geometry, teaching about angle measures and angle units, this is right up our alley. And then we can also use things like measuring tape or tape measures or yardsticks to measure the distance and do conversion into units as well for our drones. All the while they're doing this, as they're thinking about the constraints that they have, they're a really, really powerful opportunity for our students to recognize things like programmatic logic when we think about structures and pieces of instructions that can get used over and over again, combining that with the motion blocks. So we're thinking about what those pieces physically mean and building them in on top of each other. And then we have to really encourage our students. Why did you pick the flight pattern that you picked? What's the difference that you have in your front yard between your neighbor's front yard, or did you pick somebody else's front yard? We can think through the ethics of that. So now we're really doing much more than simple data synthesis. We are really increasing our students' capacity to think about their processes and why they're making decisions that they are making. So now for the third scenario, really, really cool, really, really fun. I'll go through this one a little bit more quickly because we are running down on some time, but I love this for our students who are pre-algebra, algebra learners, even our high school students, because there's the ability to really engage some complex thinking, even beyond what we may have seen in Scratch previously. Oh, really good question. Karen asked, can the drone go to our school to pick up material? Depends on your drone. Uh, the actual drone that we use in our courses and the one that connects to our software is really small, has a limited flight range of a couple hundred feet, or feet, not feet. I don't know what feet are, feet. But the drone really doesn't have much of a payload capacity either. Maybe a couple of ounces, so think of a pencil. So if you need to pick up your favorite pencil from the school, that's something that might be possible. But Amazon is currently actually flying drones in the United States doing up to 5-pound deliveries. UPS is also doing the experiments where they have a fleet of drones in North Carolina that do drone delivery. We're seeing drones more and more being used in the space to do delivery and actually solve the real world problems for things like material pickup, delivering things for right on time or just in time, production and manufacturing, delivering medicine. Um, these things are still abstract, but we can really build the foundation for how we will use them in the future. Really good question. I would love to be able to send a drone to a school autonomously. That would be a thrill for students. Scenario number three, once again, a little higher order thinking and will involve some more shall I say, complex ideas when we think about geometry and math. So the first thing we want to do is we want to encourage our students to model real world understanding using mathematics. Learning about geometric mathematical expression is really, really powerful for this. And once again, we want them to look for and make use of structure. That's really going to be important because if they can understand the form to an instruction and how that will help them accomplish a task or form to mathematical thinking, they can expand upon, um, build upon that structure and use and modify that structure for different scenarios. So this scenario is synchronized flight. Students will need to construct a flight program for the drone to fly multiple geometric patterns in such a way that it will they will not collide with other drones flying in the same area. Something that's come into vogue in the last 5 years, really, really cool, is the idea of doing drone light shows instead of firework experiences. Drones are really usable. They are much more environmentally friendly when you think about the waste material that comes off of fireworks versus drones. And they are also relatively quiet, almost silent. For those of us who would like to enjoy fireworks but don't do well about noises, or if we have very small children, think infants who are not going to do well with fireworks, or pets, we can really decrease the sonic disruption that our drones will cause, or fireworks would cause, by using drones instead. If you are a football fan, Super Bowl, I want to say maybe 5, maybe even 6 years ago, featured Lady Gaga jumping from the top of the stadium, and there was a drone light show behind her. If you haven't seen that video, check it out on YouTube. Really, really cool stuff. In order for those drones to fly, the drones are communicating with each other, but they're also doing a really good job of flying geometric patterns. And they're able to fly these geometric patterns in different ways by using simple pieces of code better than having their values changed. So let's take a look at what kind of algebraic thinking would be involved as our students participate with that. And I will do this very quickly. So love our program once again. And you'll have to forgive me through for flying through this discussion, this part of the webinar, but we want to make sure that we at least show it. Also, a benefit is the fact that because you're attending today, you'll have a copy of the webinar recording emailed to you as well. So you can access that and take a look back at any point in time. We always start with the takeoff because we want our drone in the air, but we also need to define a variable. The drone is able to recognize in its software the ability to change values based on sensor or just some very basic math. In this case, I'll define a variable. Oh, you need to name it first. So I'll click on that variable name button. We'll call that variable distance for now. And now I can just hit the button to create the variable. This variable is empty, doesn't have any assigned value to it at all, but what we can do is we can actually define that variable to begin with. So I'll tell our drone that there is a variable called distance, and for right now, we're going to set it to 0. We'll revisit that later. My drone is in the air, and I might want it to fly a very, very simple pattern, and I might need another variable for that. So this other variable that I'll name won't be distance. We'll call it number of sides. I'll just keep that abbreviated. Number of sides. So now I've got two variables. You could call them anything that you want, but we'll think about the distance that the drone is going to fly for the side of a geometric object, and we'll think about the number of sides the object has. We can use mathematical expression and programmatic knowledge to fly in the geometric shape that we want. So I've got the number of sides. I'm going to tell my drone that instead of repeating its flight pattern 10 times, I want it to fly the right flight pattern regardless with the number of sides that I have. And now I want to think of exactly how I want my drone to fly. Instead of flying the drone forward, I can also define that with a variable. So instead of flying 100 centimeters, I can just tell my drone that I want my drone to fly a distance. And I can define my variables now to be, let's say, 400 centimeters. I could say that I would like a triangle. And the only thing that's missing is an angle measure for the turn. I have to adjust my target. So these three elements would allow me to now fly this geometric pattern. And if I take off, I'll see my drone begin to fly this pattern that is specified. Now, I've obviously made a glaring mistake because instead of flying a triangle, I've flown a three-sided figure, but it's not triangular because I got the actual measurements wrong with regards to a triangle. That's the kind of challenge that students will be running in as they are actually attempting to complete the task that you laid in front of them. Do I have an understanding of the angle measure? Can I define the angle measure in terms that are not just solid numbers that are fixed, but maybe variable numbers with mathematic expression? Much more complicated, not necessarily complicated, but higher order mathematical thinking ideas that we have available there. So with 5 minutes left, those are some ideas that we have for you. These ideas aren't there just to support the math skills, Common Core math, as you're expanding with drone thinking with students, but they're also there to support 21st century learning skills. Um, Most of you have heard of the 4 C's when you think about those learning skills: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. But we think about literacy skills and life skills, and those create a more holistic and rounded learner. And the whole goal is to get our students and keep our students competitive for a job market that we know is changing radically. So what are our next steps? What are the things that you can do to continue to encourage and empower your students when it comes to mathematics learning? First, you can expand on the lessons, equipment, and professional development with Next Wave STEM. As I mentioned before, you're a part of this professional development series with us. The email that we will send out today will also include the professional development hours for you. But we have curricula in drones that's suited for 3 to 5 and for the high school level. Take a look at that curricula. Go through it. It's free for you to access. Take a look at the equipment, or not the equipment, but the curricula that's available for robotics, for 3D printing, as well the other curricula offering that we have at Next Wave STEM. But we also want to encourage you to connect with us on social media. Next Wave STEM is on Twitter, we're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Haven't made it to TikTok yet. That may be coming in the near future. And feel free to reach out to either myself on the left, Desmond at Next Wave STEM, or my colleague Michelle on the right, Michelle at Next Wave STEM. We are available to make sure that you have the resources that you need, and we can dig into the lessons some more with you, since we're also the curriculum writers. So came in a little bit hot here, only have a minute left, but I do want to pause for anyone who has any questions about anything or has any comments. Nicole says, is there a limit to how long we have access to the curriculum? Yes, the curricula is going to be available to you for free for the remainder of the school year. I want to say going into August, but I can double check on that and make sure that I get back to you. Great question. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. We hope that you find the material useful. Let us know how it goes, just like Michelle said. As you're using it with your students, as you're gearing up and you want to roll it out, we'd love to know how we can make it better. So yes, absolutely connect with us. We'll be hearing from you soon. And you're encouraging as well. If you haven't already, register for our next webinar on Thursday featuring 3D printing with Michelle. Um, is there a survey? Yes, there is a survey that will be going out to you in the email as well. But once again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.